So this is community ecology video number 2, and another type of interaction between two different populations or populations within a community is facilitation, and this is where a species has a positive effect on the survival and reproduction of other species without necessarily living in direct or intimate contact of a symbiosis. So for example, let's look at a salt marsh. So here we have a salt marsh, and there's a species of plant that grows here that is, I'm not really sure how you pronounce the Latin and Greek name, but it makes the soil more hospitable for other plant species. It helps prevent salt buildup and create shade and reduces evaporation. So the presence of this plant here in the salt marsh makes the whole community a better place to live for other species. And when you remove these plants, there are 50% less plant species in the areas of the salt marsh simply because of their absence. So they kind of facilitate and make the community a better place to live. So facilitation represent positive environmental modifications that literally extend beyond the body of the facilitator. So it's not just that plant benefiting, but their presence has a positive impact for lots of other species. And so that is your box number 1 of your second set of 8 boxes. And so when we look at biological communities, though, they differ in their diversity and trophic structure. So when we look at what species diversity means, it has 2 components. We have species richness and also relative abundance. Both of those together make up species diversity. So species richness is the number of different species in the community. So if you were to count them. And then relative abundance is the proportion of each species in the community. So if we have 2 communities here, community A and community B, we can see, let me just move this first. So here you can see how the community A has a series of different trees living in this forest. Community B, now when we look at the 2 communities, we can see that for species richness, they have 4 species. So they both have 4 species of trees. However, the relative abundance is different. In the first one, it's all pretty even, about 25% of the forest. In community B, you can see how this tree here, makes up 75% of that community. It's not as even, I guess you could say. So then if a parasitic animal came, like an invasive species like a bark beetle or something, was introduced into the communities and only attacked that species of tree, you can see how community A has a greater resiliency. Community A is going to survive that invasive species as a whole better than community B. Okay, so like here is there's my husband down in the bottom of a waterfall in Costa Rica. You can see there's lots of species richness as well as you can kind of see the relative abundance. That one you might have to count a little bit more detail. Versus here's my husband in Alaska. You can see there's not as much species richness. You see the same species of tree in that forest. And then here are the chaparral ecosystem near Ojai, California. Here has not trees, but there are quite a few different kinds of bush type plants. So that would have species richness and kind of like relative abundance. Here's me and Miss Mueller in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Here, not as many species, but if you were to look at the different types, there's about species evenness for the amount of the abundance. Okay, so now 2 things make up species diversity, and then what is the difference between species richness and relative abundance, and that's your box 2. Okay, so our next part of community ecology is trophic structure. And here, this is looking at the dynamics of a community, but really dealing with feeding relationships and different trophic levels. So we talk about food chains and food webs and the organisms that make them up. So here I have a community and different populations interacting together. So here I have my herbivores. We call our herbivores. Here I have the plants. We call these the primary producers. They're the first things to produce basically free energy. They're going to take sunlight and convert it into a usable form. Then we have our herbivores. Our herbivores are going to be the first to eat, so we call them our primary consumers. So we have our primary consumers as our next trophic level. And when we use arrows like this, what this represents is a flow of energy. So when the deer eats the plant, the energy flows from the plant to the deer. And then you have your next trophic level. So our next animals to eat would be our secondary consumers. And then, and secondary consumers can be both herbivores or carnivores, omnivores. And then you have your top level, which are going to be your tertiary consumers. Now, sometimes there's even an additional trophic level, and we would call that the quaternary consumers. Okay, and so here, primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. And then there might be possibly a fourth, like a quaternary consumers. And you can kind of summarize the different trophic levels in box 3. And so how they interact together matters. So, for example, let's say the top predators are hunted. Well, now their absence has an impact on the trophic levels below them. So now their prey species numbers would increase. And they'd have possibly exponential growth, at least temporarily, until what they ate decreased. And then you'd have a population collapse of those species. You'd have a decline. So when you remove species from food webs, there's different impacts on the different trophic levels. And we'll explore those more in class, the different examples and scenarios. Now, not all species have such a large impact, like that top predator mattered, but if I were to remove the grasshopper, it may not be as detrimental to the whole food web as removing a top predator. So there are species, though, that do have a larger impact than others. We have dominant species. Now, the dominant species is the most abundant species. So it's not necessarily the most important. It just means if you were to literally count them, they would be the most abundant. And then you have the keystone species. And this is not usually abundant, but has a strong control on the community structure. Not by numerical might, but by their pivotal ecological roles or niches. So these keystone species have a large impact on the whole balance of that community. So like wolves of Yellowstone is an example. And then there's something called a foundation species. And the foundation species dramatically alter their environment. So here you have a dam from a beaver. So the fact that the presence of that beaver building this dam, you can kind of see how it slows down the water behind it. And so it creates like a pool. Well, this is an essential like nursing, like a nursery area for like little hatchling fish. So by slowing down the river and having it flow more calmly, now you have a place for like other species to grow and develop. The beavers also play a role in maintaining like the forest and the trees and kind of keeping the tree population in check a little bit. So anyway, okay. My pictures are out of order, but when I went to Yellowstone, I had the privilege of seeing wolves in Yellowstone, and so in class we'll watch a video about the wolves of Yellowstone. All right, so what is the difference between dominant species and keystone species? And that gets to go in your box 4. And then the last thing we're going to look at in this chapter is ecological succession. So this is how predictable changes in a community over time. So here are my children. This is in the eastern California along Highway 395. There were some lava beds. So here we are just hiking in lava fields. But anyway, so here's also a picture in Arizona of lava that has hardened from a volcano from about 1,000 years ago, around 1100 AD. And you can see now, 900 or so years later, you can see that there are plants starting to grow on this lava fields and starting to have the community regrow. So some of the first things that will show up on bare rock are things called lichens. And lichens are 2 different species living together. So that's an example of symbiosis. But because they both benefit, it's a type of symbiosis called mutualism. So with this, you would have your, with this you would have an algae and a fungus living together on bare rock, and that would, they both benefit. And so with the lichens, though, what they do is they'll wear down those rock layers and create like a layer of soil. And then, oh, here's some more lichens. I don't know if I took this picture up in Colorado. Colorado has some beautiful lichens. But anyway, so they live on bare rock. They begin to break the rock down. They create like a, oh, here's lichens in Yosemite. These pretty orange things are lichens growing on the rocks there. And so what they do is they start to build a soil layer where now like grasses can grow and different species can begin to move into the area. So once lichens are there, they're the pioneer species, then you'll have like small mosses and grass, and then eventually you'll have shrubs. So if you look at like the Galapagos, these were islands formed by volcanoes, and over time you had grasses and species are able to be supported on these islands. So those predictable changes that go through a community over time, if it's primary succession is like the Galapagos, where you start out on bare rock, on like lava fields, and then you, what happens is you eventually reach what's called a climax community. So over like the thousands of years, as those ecosystems change, or communities change, the animals and plants that live in those change as well. Eventually you reach a climax community. So you can kind of see, I like this picture here, because you can kind of see how the soil level builds up. And so once you have bare rock, then you have lichens and then small grasses. Then when you have small grasses, you can have insects living there. And then once you have like flowers, you have pollinators moving in. You might have like worms and maybe even snakes, like mice. Some smaller animals can now be supported in this community. And then as the depth of the soil increases, you can support more plants. So you would have like some bushes and smaller species of trees move in. And then eventually you would have like the, I guess, intermediate stages be replaced by the climax communities. These are a lot longer lived species that will represent the community for hundreds of years. And the important part here, though, with succession, it's not just that it's predictable changes in the community structure, but the fact that, to think more deeply, that as the plant species change, the animals that can be supported in that area also change. And this takes hundreds of years if it's starting out after like a forest fire. So when you have secondary succession, you don't have to worry about starting out on bare rock. Instead, soil already exists. So with secondary succession, it may only take about 100 years for the plant species to recolonize this area. And this is where you would have exponential growth, and then eventually also reaching a climax community. So oftentimes following a fire or a disturbance, you can see the community start to regrow. Okay, and then compare and contrast primary and secondary succession in your last box, box 5. Awesome, good job.